For someone whose everyday life was suddenly shattered by an act of sexual violence, the trauma can affect you long after one horrible attack. You don't know where to go or who to turn to, and people are more concerned with what you were wearing or what you were drinking, rather than who assaulted you and how you're feeling.
I'm Naomi Hanna.
I'm Alejandro Guzman.
I'm Andres Baez.
And I'm Alejandro Lucero. And in our presentation, we will be talking about the effects that acquaintance rape has on students. To what extent does acquaintance rape affect students? We believe acquaintance rape has many effects on students, whether it's in the physical aspect with injuries, mental, or academic performance.
What are the physical effects of acquaintance rape on students? One physical effect of rape is the possibility of HIV. So, what is HIV? HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus. It is a disease that attacks your immune system and it is contracted through sex. Contracting this disease will forever affect the victim's life. It is very traumatic. According to a study of 2 South African women, the thought of being at risk to HIV led her to contemplate suicide. But when the results came back negative, she exclaimed, "I was so happy." This is a perfect example of how a physical effect can lead to a negative effect on a victim's mental health, which is a topic my teammate Alejandro will talk more about. To add on, another physical effect of being acquaintance raped is the possibility of pregnancy. The following statistics inform us about the type of perpetrator among rape victims who experience rape-related pregnancy. We can see that acquaintance has 91.80% and stranger has 5.30. Rape-related pregnancies were way more common in cases where the victim was raped by an acquaintance than by a stranger. Sadly, rape-related pregnancies are committed at a high rate, and it's usually by someone you know. Another physical effect is physical injury. Some common physical injuries are cuts, bruises, or injuries to the victim's sex organs. In this graph, we can see the type of perpetrator among rape victims who experience genital injuries. We can see that acquaintance has 29% and stranger has 15%. This shows that victims are more common to have genital injuries when they're raped by an acquaintance than by a stranger. We need to do something to stop this violence.
Building up on what Naomi said, now we're going to look deeper into how those acquaintance rapes affects the mental health of the victims. On an article called Perpetration Experiences and Gender Predicting Empathy with Strangers or Acquaintance Rapists, written by Radi Orth and Miss Usman, where they state that rape to strangers is more likely to happen and is taken as a more serious matter than acquaintance rape. Sadly, this could provoke that people might want to commit acquaintance rape because they feel they're not going to have the same punishment as someone who committed rape to a stranger. On SUNY College Department of Psychology made a study where they showed that some mental effects that victims can go through is depression, social anxiety, suicidal thoughts, and the feeling of betrayal because they feel they don't have no one to trust or where to go. On this graph, we can see how the long-term effects on the victim's mental health. As we can see here, 67.1% suffer from PTSD, 23.6% contemplate the idea of committing suicide, and 9.3% attempt suicide. A news provided by CBS News tells the story about a girl in the University of Alabama who was raped by an acquaintance in her class. After that, she tried reporting it to the authorities, but they didn't take it as a serious matter. They thought it was something else because she knew this person beforehand. Sadly, because she didn't know who to trust or where to go because no one took her serious, she ended up committing suicide because she didn't know where to go or who to trust.
Next, we're going to talk about the effects that acquaintance rape has on academic performance. First, Taylor D. Mussel, a graduate student in counseling psychology at the University of Lethbridge, interviewed a student from a Nigerian university who details multiple attempts of trying to distance herself from a faculty member who kept asking her to come over to his house and also making sexual proposals to her. This, of course, making her really uncomfortable, made her take the decision to skip some classes and to not show up to school some days. This, of course, is a clear example of a hostile academic environment. Because of the fear and anxiety, the students tend to miss school or skip some classes, which ultimately has an effect on their grades, which will be later touched on. But now looking at this graph provided to us by Professor Cermak, who is based at the University of Toronto, she found that at her university, victims of acquaintance rape have a mean academic non-attendance, as you can see here in the brown, of around 700, more specifically 684. And when being compared to those students with no history of acquaintance rape, we can see here in the grade that the mean academic non-attendance is around 178. This shows the big gap that there is between these two groups when it comes to attendance and as you can see in the following graph, the effects it has in the grades. Victims of acquaintance rape have 15% of them reported a GPA below 2.5, as you can see here, and those that aren't victims of acquaintance rape reported a GPA below 2.5 of just 5%. This just goes back to the mental effects of things, as either the trauma that students experience after experiencing acquaintance rape, or the fear of anxiety of potentially becoming one. And as shown in the last graph, it has a huge impact on their attendance, and as shown in this graph, and the effects it has on the negative effect it has on their grades.
Together, with our research, we were able to come up with some solutions. Informational programs could be available to try and inform students about acquaintance rape and possibly showing them red flags in the relationship. For example, if this person realizes that they're in a controlling relationship, they can notice this, and this will put them into the idea that they need to get out of this dangerous situation. With this solution comes limitations. Rape is never the victim's fault, and they need to be able to understand these red flags and fully capture them, and then after that they need to be able to get out of this relationship. It's not always possible to get out of a relationship, and not everyone is strong enough to get out, as it is a very hard thing to do. Our second solution, other programs could be created to get the victim the help they need after an attack, whether this is with medical assistance if they have suffered any physical injuries, mental health assistance like therapy and other therapies, as it's very important that mental health is kept in check, as it can have some very dire consequences. And lastly, but not least important, academic is also very important, and we would like to be able to help them keep their grades up with all the stress that they are going through. Thank you for your time. Any questions?
Let's group together, actually. All right, perfect. We're going to start over with Team Alejandro and work our way across. So, Mr. Guzman first. If you had another team member in your group, what perspective or limitation could they have reached that would have made a useful contribution to the project?
I will say that most likely social effects, how people look at these events, how they look at acquaintance rape, how they feel about the victim could have been an interesting point to prove, and will really help us to look outside of just students or how that victims feel, but how all the people feel about it.
All right. Alejandro, number 2. How did the group decide how to include Naomi's perspective into your overall presentation?
When we were thinking about this topic for rape and we were coming up with our ideas, physical injury was always something we wanted to include. As for acquaintance rape, it's something extremely common, as not everyone has that type of control. So we really wanted to incorporate this to keep the idea of how a student can be harmed.
Okay. Next up. All right, Andres, if you could give one specific way your thinking changed as a result of Alejandro Guzman's findings.
I would say that because I was investigating how this impacted their academic performance, Alejandro's mental health really came together with my topic because a lot of these grades, a lot of the students' grades are impacted by their mental health. A lot of, like I mentioned, a lot of them go through anxiety and the fear of potentially becoming a victim. So it showed me that their mental health is what dictates the most their grades.
Okay.
on the academic performance.
Naomi, reflecting on your colleagues' work, which one had the greatest impact on your understanding of this problem?
I believe the person that had the perspective with the greatest impact was Alejandro's, which was about mental health. He talked about victims were really struggling with mental health. They had social anxiety, they had a lot of depression, and well, it really connected to my topic, which showed how physical injuries were affected by mental health, and it changed basically everything. It affected every single topic, every single perspective each of us had.
Guys are done.